Now, today, we're going to talk about the year 1863, and I would love to get us to the spring of 1864. Now, the war at this point, and really my series at this point, is reaching its halfway point. But as soon as I say that, I want to walk back and retract that statement because anyone living at this time isn't going to just wake up one day in 1863 and say, well, gee, things are bad, but at least the war is halfway over. Nobody knew at this time that the war was halfway over, or for that matter, how bad things were going to get before they finally got better again. And so I want us to forget for a moment that we know what's coming, that there's going to be Appomattox in the spring of 1865, and all of this will finally come to an end. I want us to forget that for a moment and focus in on these events. And I have to say as well, whenever I talk about the Civil War in just an hour, which is difficult, of course, I usually skip over this point in time because it seems to be easily glossed over. You know, 64 and 65 are really the monumentous events, the coup de grace, and especially here at the Shoals. But I want us to resist that temptation to skip over it and really dive into these events, to not overlook them. And at points today, I'm really going to talk about things that happen further afield from the Shoals, but I hope that we see how developments in the region at large are really inextricable from what takes place here. That, in other words, developments in the Western theater have a way of influencing directly what took place here in Florence and the Shoals. And then in that same vein, secondly, how I hope that we see that events on the macro scale, the movements of large armies and the decisions of generals, have a way of trickling down through their subordinates, yes, but then also into the communities that are affected by the decisions of generals. That, in other words, individual people experience the war in a micro context, the war that is also taking place simultaneously in a macro context, that we're really talking about the experiences of people. And I hope that I can give some really good examples to illustrate that point to you today. And in my wanting to skip over 1863 generally in my summary of the war, I'm not alone in this. Henry Halleck, the commander of all Western armies, in one of his retrospective reports, describes this time by saying, the winter and spring were passed with raids and unimportant skirmishes. Raids and unimportant skirmishes. But of course, if that raid or skirmish took place in front of your house, or if you were involved in that, it would certainly not feel like it was unimportant or inconsequential. So I want us to avoid that kind of big picture thinking to an extent and zoom in. Now, this photograph, and I will feature heavily photographs today from the Matthew Brady collection. Matthew Brady is arguably the single most famous photographer of the Civil War. His work in the Eastern Theater in Antietam, for example, really has documented the war in a visceral kind of way. Now, I don't know if Brady was actually here at Chattanooga or the Shoals in 63, 64, but his one of his agents would have been. This is pulling a steamboat up a part of the Tennessee River called the Suck, which is up closer to the Tennessee, to Chattanooga. We'll see a lot of his images today. And also, this is going to be quite map heavy. So I love maps, if you hadn't noticed, but I'm going to try and narrate through them so that if you're not so keen on them, you'll still be able to get what we need to get out of them. And I've got a long way to go, so let's get to it. So this is our roadmap for the events today. I'm going to give us a very quick review of what we talked about so far to get us up to this moment in time. We'll talk about spring 1863 with Corinth, Mississippi as a base of federal operations, and the Shoals of the Tennessee River finding itself as a kind of wedge between two fronts of the federal army. And as part of that, we'll discuss Straits and Cornyn's raids. We'll discuss events further afield in the summer of 1863 at Tullahoma and Chickamauga. In October 1863, we'll talk about how William Tecumseh Sherman comes to the Shoals and what that means for local people. We'll talk about a shift in operations from Corinth to Pulaski, Tennessee, and then some skirmishes through the spring of 1864 here in Lauderdale County, time permitting. Now, this is a map of what we discussed last time. So we saw how 2 battles at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, Federal victories, enabled the Federal Army to have control of the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, respectively. When the Federal Army took control of the Cumberland River, the Confederates abandoned Nashville and retreated out of Middle Tennessee by way of Decatur and regrouped at Corinth, Mississippi. General Ulysses S. Grant moved by way of the Tennessee River to around Savannah, Tennessee, and General Don Carlos Buell moved overland from Nashville to rendezvous at Savannah, which, whenever Albert Sidney Johnston contested their foothold on the Tennessee River, resulted in the Battle of Shiloh, April 6th and 7th, 1862. In the immediate aftermath of Shiloh, General Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, the Federal officer, took Huntsville, Alabama, and proceeds to occupy basically all of the Tennessee River north of the Tennessee River. And finally, the Federals do take Corinth the last day of May, 1862. And this is a big confusing mess. Don't pay attention to it. I'm going to summarize it. And after the Federals take Corinth, Mississippi, Grant and Buell are sent their separate ways. Grant is going to be charged with taking Vicksburg, Mississippi, on the Mississippi River, and Buell is ordered to take Chattanooga, which is the gateway to Georgia and East Tennessee. And so Buell begins moving through the shoals and North Alabama at a snail's pace. He crosses the Tennessee River at Florence, June 25th, 1862. His army takes apart the warehouses and storehouses of Florence to build a bridge for themselves. Now, Confederate commander at Tupelo, Braxton Bragg, is not going to just wait for Buell to take his time to take Chattanooga. He does him one better and moves his entire army from Tupelo and takes Chattanooga. When Bragg gets wind of this, somewhere between Huntsville and Stevenson, When Buell gets wind of this, the Federal commander, he loses his nerve. And what this map shows us is that Bragg, the Confederate commander, invades Kentucky, and Buell gives up North Alabama to chase him into Kentucky. They practically go all the way back to the Ohio River. Buell retreats to Louisville. And what you need to know for our purposes today is that Bragg's invasion of Kentucky is ultimately repulsed at Perryville, and Bragg retreats back out of Kentucky and regroups at Murfreesboro. Now, Buell, the Federal commander, has been on thin ice with Washington, and after Kentucky is invaded by the rebels, Washington has had enough. And his failure to pursue Bragg after Perryville means that he is sacked. Buell is fired, and in his place is promoted General William Stark Rosecrans. Now, Rosecrans, while all of this is happening, Rosecrans and Grant have secured the Federal foothold at Corinth. The rebel commander Earl Van Dorn attempts to force the Federal army out of Corinth, but that is unsuccessful. Grant and Rosecrans, especially at battles at Iuka, Boonville, places that should be familiar to us, solidify the Federal stronghold at Corinth, Mississippi. And Rosecrans, because of his Gold Star performance there, is promoted in Buell's stead. And Rosecrans makes his headquarters at Nashville in the end of the year 1862. Washington is very impatient with General Rosecrans. They don't want him to just sit on his butt in Nashville, and they send him dispatch after dispatch telling him that he needs to move his army in advance. The result of this, the last day of the year 1862 and the first 2 days of the year 1863 are the Battle of Stone's River near Murfreesboro, where Bragg is repulsed from Murfreesboro and falls back on Tullahoma, Tennessee, with the Cumberland Plateau in an area called the Barrens to his back. And Rosecrans sets up shop at Murfreesboro. So that gets us to the point in time that we're talking about today. Now, before I move forward with military events, I want to take a moment to talk about what life would have been like here at the Shoals at the end of the new year, at the end of the year 62, the beginning of the new year 1863. And the way that we know this, the Florence Gazette, the local newspaper, had ceased publication right before the Battle of Shiloh. And they don't publish at all through most of the year 1862. Right at the end of the year, in December, they start publishing again, very briefly. They're just publishing basically 2 sheets, a single sheet of paper with writing on the front and the back. They apologize for this. They apologize for how small the paper is, but they said, of course, we really can't get paper to print a newspaper. And this first issue, December 10th, 1862, has a really touching appeal here to the local citizens. They say, "Who has got any turkeys, eggs, chickens, butter, dried fruit, meal, or flour, or anything else to live on and for which they are willing to take a living price for? If anyone has, and you are willing to bring it to town and let our citizens have it on terms reasonable, we say bring your marketing in and you can dispose of it readily. The high prices of provisions in town make it almost impossible for the poorer class of our citizens to procure the necessities of life. Provisions and wood are so very dear that they suffer for the want of them." And they say as well, interestingly, "While speaking of wood, we will say to our wood hauling friends who live in the country or town either, that if they wish to subscribe to our little gazette and pay for it in wood, they can now do so, as wood is the same as money to us." Now, this is rather comical to think about, but to think that they're willing to take wood in lieu of actual monetary payment because it's such a scarce commodity in addition to the stuff of life, the foodstuffs. Now, in contrast to this, around the same time, Christmas Day 1862, Sally Foster, who lives in the Courtview Mansion at the end of Court Street, she is a very well-to-do young lady, 14 years old at this time. She's almost bragging in her diary whenever she says, "I do not expect you received any gifts, but I did. I got 2 mats, 2 collars, a pair of gloves, and some beads to wear on my head. And now I'm writing out of a beautiful inkstand I received. It is cast iron with a glass ink bottle and a sandbox, and also a place to put my pens, so I am fixed very nicely. Ma gave me all of the things except for one of the collars." So for the upper class at this time, for those who still have the means to procure supplies and even luxuries, life, I'm sure, would have been changed, would have been difficult, but they're still living more or less the same now. By the time we get to the middle of 1863 and the period we're talking about today, even for the upper class, things would be materially changed. So this is the status quo that had developed by about the first of the year 1863, which is important for us to know as we examine what comes next. As I mentioned, General William Stark Rosecrans, with his Army of the Cumberland, occupies Murfreesboro, Tennessee. His Confederate opponent is General Braxton Bragg in and around Tullahoma. Meanwhile, in central Mississippi, you have General Ulysses S. Grant with the Army of the Tennessee. He is facing off against General Pemberton at Vicksburg and the leader of Confederate forces in the West, Joseph E. Johnston, at Jackson, Mississippi. Smack dab in the middle of these 2 massive wings, 2 massive fronts, are the shoals of the Tennessee River. The Federal commander at Corinth, General Grenville Mellon Dodge, faces off against a host of homegrown Confederate cavalry groups, most notably Philip Roddy of the 4th Alabama Cavalry. He has others as well in his pocket. Roddy is a native of Moulton, Alabama, and so we think about at this time that Roddy and the Confederates are really operating quite literally in their own backyards against the Federal presence entrenched at the critical junction of Corinth, Mississippi. Now, the Federals also occupy Memphis and Jackson and Nashville and other points, but this line here, drawing between Murfreesboro and essentially Vicksburg, is the Federal line, and the rest of the state of Alabama, especially south of the Tennessee River, is Confederate country. Now, Dodge's presence at Corinth is an opportunity for a class of citizens, specifically for local Unionists living in the Hill Country, especially Franklin County, Alabama, Marion County, Alabama. Many of them make it behind Union lines at Corinth in the fall of 1862 and early in 63 and join Union regiments. And it's also early at this time, after the Emancipation Proclamation has gone into effect at Corinth, that Dodge is going to be very active in organizing people who have escaped bondage into regiments for the first time ever in United States history, really, into regiments of people of African descent. And these men, of course, also hail from North Alabama and the Tennessee River. Now, the Tennessee River at this time in early 1863 is crisscrossed time and time again by Confederate groups who are looking to harass General Rosecrans and his flanks to get up over the shoals behind Rosecrans. Now, basically the suburbs of Nashville are held by the Federal Army, but the Confederate cavalry, notably General Joseph Wheeler and Nathan Bedford Forrest and Josiah Patterson, these are names that will probably be familiar to a lot of us, are operating in Middle Tennessee against Rosecrans. But Roddy and his homegrown groups are really constantly threatening Rosecrans and his flanks. And Rosecrans appeals repeatedly to General Dodge to get a clamp on this, to at least keep the Confederates distracted enough that they can't materially threaten his lines of operation against Bragg. And that status quo is going to be the impetus for the next two events that we're going to discuss in a little greater depth. The first of them is Straight's raid. I made this map, by the way. As I said, I love maps, and I oftentimes find that the resources available online just don't quite cut it for me, so I make them myself. So Straight's raid, as I said, Rosecrans is opposing Bragg and trying to get the best of him, as all Civil War commanders ultimately tried to do, without risking a lot of bloodshed. It would be one thing to move his army completely en masse against Bragg at Tullahoma, but he knows it's going to be a bloodbath. So he's going to try and do it in a sneaky kind of way. And he orders that Abel Strait, and actually Abel Strait had the idea, but Rosecrans gave the approval. He orders that Strait will go on this really circuitous raid through rebel territory, through this really rugged country in what we call the Hill Country, and get behind General Bragg to the railroad that runs from Atlanta to Chattanooga to Tullahoma, the railroad that supposedly is Bragg's lifeline. He is tethered as a means to supplying his men to the railroad from further south, from the Confederate heartland. And the idea is that if Strait can take his men to break that railroad, then it might compel Bragg to give up the city of Tullahoma without risking much of a fight. So Strait comes down the Tennessee River, lands at Eastport, and joins his command briefly with General Dodge. They move in tandem towards the east and arrive at Tuscumbia on Sunday, April 26th. Now, the idea was that it was going to make it seem like Strait was just part of one of Dodge's many raids, but that he would break away secretly while the Confederates were distracted and move before they could be any the wiser about his movement. So Strait moves south from Tuscumbia to Russellville. By Tuesday the 28th, he's in Moulton. Now, Strait is plagued by misadventure from the very start. His expedition is delayed. They don't have enough horses and mules for the men. They think that they can get horses from the country, but they find that it's already been depleted by all of the raids that have happened for the past 4 months. And so his men, in many cases, are walking or they are riding on mules, which are much slower than the horses that they were expecting to have. It rained constantly. These mountainous roads became nightmares to traverse, and they are really slow going in their progress. Now, Strait actually, by the time he gets to Moulton, would have been in familiar territory. Abel Strait was at Decatur the previous year, 1862, and actually was responsible for trying to organize local Unionists who were already escaping behind federal lines into Union regiments. And he had actually led an expedition the previous year to this place, Day's Gap. On April 29th, 1863, he's back at Day's Gap. At this point, the Federal cavalry, led by mostly Nathan Bedford Forrest, catches up to Strait, and their luck really begins to change. They have a protracted skirmish in and around Crooked Creek, which is now in Cullman County, Alabama. And at this point, they're just trying to stay one step ahead of the Confederate cavalry and keep themselves from all being captured. From Bluntsville to Gadsden, finally to Galesville, Alabama, Sunday, May 3rd, where Forrest catches up to them. They realize the jig is up, and Strait and his men are surrendered. Strait will end up in Libby Prison in Richmond. He'll eventually be exchanged, like so many officers were. Funny enough, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, learned of Strait's capture from a Richmond newspaper. He read it in a rebel newspaper that Strait had been captured, and he telegraphed General Rosecrans asking, "Is this true?" So it really took a while for this information to trickle through the high command of the disaster that had just taken place. Now, as I said, General Dodge tried to cover this movement by pressing a raid as far as Cortland in Lawrence County, Alabama. And at that time, local people obviously would have been greatly impacted. And one of them, a man living at Leeton, was an enslaved person named Stephen Coleman. Mr. Coleman described himself in his Southern Claims petition as a common laborer and a minister of the gospel. So whenever soldiers of Dodge's command came to his home in April 1863, he says that they, quote, swore a good deal and said they knew that no Negro owned such property here in the South. So in other words, they tried to take his property, and he said, this is my property. And they said, no, we know that no black person owns property like this in the South. And they threatened him at gunpoint to give up his horse. His wife, America Coleman, talks about how the soldiers took from them 2 bed sheets, 4 bed quilts, and 2 counterpanes, which are kind of like coverlets on the bed. The reason that the soldiers took their bedding was in order to use them as kind of makeshift haversacks to carry off grain with them back to camp. So they took whatever they could get their hands on, basically, from Mr. and Mrs. Coleman.